Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I am Miss Lee and we are still in Unit 2 Biological Basis of Behavior. We are finishing out the brain in this video with the brain part 2. This second section is going to cover the higher functioning area of the brain known as the cerebral cortex. This is the part of the human brain that sets it apart from all other species, and it is the part of the brain that makes you uniquely you. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. Okay, so a lot of times people might get a little bit confused about what is cerebral cortex versus what is cerebrum. Cerebral cortex is technically the outer layer of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is both gray and white matter. It is the biggest part of the brain. It's going to comprise of the largest part of the brain, and it is the most prominent part of the brain. The cerebral cortex is the gray area that covers the outside of the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter that covers the inner white matter of the cerebrum. And the cerebral cortex is responsible for most of the sophisticated information processing of the brain. All of the higher order things that we do as humans that other animals cannot, that is because of the cerebral cortex. Here is a picture of the lobes of the cerebrum. These are all of the parts that make up the cerebrum. And we're going to go lobe by lobe through the different areas. We've already covered the cerebellum, so I just want to have this on the picture so that it kind of orients you where you are. We will start in the front and work our way back. So we're going to start with our frontal lobe. So our frontal lobe, it's also called the prefrontal cortex, and you may actually see it either way. A lot of times people use this interchangeably. Technically, there are some medical differences, but for our purposes, you may see it either way. It controls functions, like I said, like judgment, planning, anything that is abstract in nature. It is also responsible for producing speech sounds, controlling emotions, your personality, your temperament, which is a little bit different than your personality. It is responsible for movement because in the frontal cortex at the back is found the motor cortex or the somatomotor cortex. And what this does is it works with the motor cortex to make precise movements. So your frontal lobe and your somatomotor cortex are going to work together. One of the most important figures in psychology, at least as far as case studies go, is a gentleman named Phineas Gage. And he is very well known in the area of anatomy, especially brain anatomy. So back in 1846, Gage was a very well liked, very well respected railroad foreman. So he was the boss, and he was responsible for clearing paths for railroad tracks. So as legend has it, one day he was working and clearing out areas with explosives, and an accident happened, and as a result, the tamping iron that you actually see in the portrait with Phineas Gage was shot through his head, okay? So apparently what happened was he had his mouth open and it shot up through the roof of his mouth, back behind his eye, and out of his frontal lobe, all the way out. In the accident, Phineas Gage was permanently damaged, but he survived. He survived with no speech, motor, or memory impairment, but he did have severe damage to the frontal lobe. So what kind of things could you assume about Phineas Gage? How do you think he would be different? I'm going to let you pause here and jot down some predictions. Part of the frontal lobe in the back is the motor cortex. You also may see it as somatomotor cortex. This is in the back of the frontal lobe, largely responsible for voluntary movement of parts of the body. So body parts that you want to move, if you want to move your hand or your arm or your legs, or you want to dance or sway around, those actions are being done because of your motor cortex. What's really cool is if parts of the motor cortex are stimulated, say you go down to your corner brain surgery store and you decide that you want to have some exploratory brain surgery. If they were able to stimulate part of the somatomotor cortex, you would actually move your arms and legs wherever they touched. If you see on the picture, there are specific parts of the somatomotor cortex or the motor cortex that are responsible for moving specific parts of your body. Movements that are very precise or delicate are actually controlled by considerably larger portions of the motor cortex, which is pretty interesting to me. The next lobe that we're going to talk about is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe, if you pretend you're putting a headband on your head, that is about where your parietal lobe is. So it's in that mid portion of your head. And it controls things like body positioning, spatial reasoning, comprehension of touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and your somatosensory cortex is also found in the front part of the parietal lobe. Located at the front, it's largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. So if you went down to that same brain surgery store on the corner and had part of your parietal lobe, the sensory cortex, stimulated, even though nobody was actually touching you, you would perceive that you were being touched in those specific areas that were being stimulated directly on your sensory cortex. The more sensitive the area, the more surface area the cortex is dedicated to it. So very much like the motor cortex, the larger the area, the more sensitive or the more delicate that area is. And that is displayed here, that is demonstrated in what we know as a homunculus, which is kind of a strange word to say. But given the proportionality of body parts to the space in each of the cortexes, a homunculus is what the body would actually look like if it were proportionate to the space taken in each cortex. So I'm just going to let you look at this picture, let it wash over you for a moment. You notice that in the sensory model, parts of your body that are very, very sensitive. So you think about your fingertips that are able to perceive very, very minute differences in textures and temperatures. Your lips, that area, your tongue, that part of your face is very, very sensitive. Your genitals are very sensitive. Then if you look at the motor cortex, similarly, the hands take up a huge part of the motor cortex because you're able to do very, very delicate movements with your hands. Same thing for your mouth. Being able to speak takes a lot of very delicate, precise movements of your tongue, your jaw, your lips, and all those things together take a lot of your motor cortex. Okay, the next lobe is the temporal lobe, and it controls functions like hearing. It's responsible for storing long-term memories, and it is for speech and language understanding. So what I want you to do is, I want you to take your hands and I want you to pretend that you are pushing your hair back behind your ears. You are basically rolling your hands along your temporal lobe. You're sweeping your fingers along your temporal lobe. I also think of a mnemonic with temporal. It sounds like tempo, which is part of music. And so that is a little mnemonic that helps me remember tempo, temporal lobe. If you keep going back, they're in the very back, and it's directly back behind your eyes, which makes a lot of sense, is your occipital lobe. This controls functions like any aspect of vision. It's also called your primary visual cortex. Each part of your visual cortex is corresponding to a particular specific part of your retina, and that is going to only receive information from that part of the retina. We will get more into the retina and what it does in the eye when we get to sensation and perception. But just understand that what happens in the brain is where all of those pieces that are being sent to your brain from the retina are put back together to make sense in your brain. Okay, so the next part that we're going to talk about in the brain are the association areas. And these are areas that are not committed to either sensory or motor functioning. They are usually involved in higher mental functioning. The first one is Wernicke's area, pronounced Wernicke's, and it's in the left temporal lobe. So already you should be thinking about what is it going to be doing. If we know what the temporal lobe is for, we should already start thinking about sounds, and indeed it is responsible for language comprehension and the expression of language. The other very important association area that we need to know is Broca's area. This is in the left frontal lobe, and it's responsible for directing motor movement involved in speech. So it's motor movement, which makes sense because it is in the frontal lobe, and we know that the frontal lobe also has some responsibility with motor movement. A mnemonic that's really, really super silly that I always remember for Broca's area, one of my students several years ago was doing a skit, and the student said that he broca his speech, which is very silly, but I have heard it so many times and said it so many times now, and it's silly and ridiculous and it makes no sense, but it's memorable. and that's the important part. So considering the specific function of both Wernicke's and Broca's, why do their locations make sense? So I want you to come to a conclusion and be ready to talk about this in class. Okay, so the next thing that we'll cover is hemispheres. The hemispheres in the brain are roughly mirror images of each other. They are almost identical, but not quite. They do function as separate brains other than through the corpus callosum, where they communicate. All of the activity on one side is communicated to the other and vice versa. The right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere, and the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere. So we'll start from the bottom this time. This is going to be the back of the brain. So when it comes to vision, the left hemisphere, I want you to start thinking left logic, left language. The left hemisphere is for recognizing. What it specializes in is words and letters. And the right hemisphere really is able to process geometric patterns, faces, and emotional expression much more in detail. So in the part of the brain that's responsible for hearing, the left hemisphere is much more in tune with language sounds. The right hemisphere is much more for non-language sounds like music. Our memory is also lateralized. On the left hemisphere, our verbal memory or memory related to language, a conversation that you had. And the right hemisphere is much more specific towards non-verbal memory, things you saw, things you felt maybe. The left hemisphere, when it comes to language overall, is much more specialized in speech, grammar rules, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Remember that left logic. And the right hemisphere is much more in tune with emotional tone of speech. So not what you said, but how you said it. And then the right hemisphere is much more in charge of spatial ability than the left hemisphere. And it is in tune with geometry, the sense of direction, distance, and mental rotation of shapes. I was involved in a research study when I was in my undergraduate program, and what we were tasked to do was we watched a computer screen. Yes, we had computers back then, and there was a figure on the screen and it was rotating. And what I had to do as a subject was to predict what was coming up next. I had seen it rotate a number of times, and I just really wasn't all that good at it. So the researchers decided that I was much more prone to be more heavily influenced by my left hemisphere. Brain plasticity is a really interesting concept. It's also known as neuroplasticity. And basically, it is the brain's ability to continuously change throughout one's lifetime due to its use or lack thereof. And the big takeaway here is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's very true with brain plasticity. If you don't continue to practice skills, say for example, you are learning a language in high school and you're really interested in it while you're in high school, but after you get out of high school, you don't ever use French again. You never use it. Well, let's say 10 years from now, you decide you're going to go to France. Well, a lot of that has probably been forgotten because you did not utilize those skills. You didn't practice them. I think of it kind of like a pathway. If you travel down a path, like a wooded path, and you travel down it a lot of times, the dirt's going to get compacted down, the branches are going to get torn away, and it's going to be continually able to be used. So you're going to support the travel through that path. Well, the brain is the same way. If you continue to use certain pathways, certain neural pathways, then you will continue to be able to use them. If you don't, the brain prunes it away. Another way that we see brain plasticity is that brain activity associated with a certain function can be transferred to a different location, particularly if the original area becomes damaged. So it's like if you're on an interstate and you have to detour off. You can still get to where you're going. It may not be the most direct path and it may not be the easiest route, but the brain will sometimes kind of make detours in itself to move around injuries or lesions of some sort. Okay, split brain procedure. To better understand lateralization of the brain or how certain functions are only in one hemisphere, which is what we've been talking about, we learn from split brain patients, and there is a huge advantage here. To split the brain in a surgical procedure, what part of the brain would be cut, do you think? If you said the corpus callosum, you would be correct. So This type of surgery allows the two hemispheres to be split from each other, but this is only necessary in cases of severe epilepsy, and it is a last-ditch effort to bring some sort of quality of life to someone who is having almost constant seizures. And there are side effects that we now know of that we can observe in these patients to help us understand the specialization or the lateralization of each hemisphere. It's all about knowing what each side of the brain can and can't do, particularly with language and speech. This is one of the ways that it shows up most often, as well as knowing the hemispheres control opposite sides of the body. So if Sally is a split brain patient and sees a baseball in her right visual field, where does that go in her brain? It goes in the left hemisphere because she is seeing it in the right visual field. So it's going to be the opposite. Can she say she sees a baseball? Yes, because language is a left hemisphere function, and because she is seeing the baseball in her right visual field, it will be processed in her left hemisphere. If she holds a baseball in her left hand, can she say she's holding a baseball? Why or why not? Well, no, because the right brain received the info, but the right hemisphere does not have the ability to speak. And that is it for the brain part 2. In our next video, we'll be talking about drugs and consciousness. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.